A man is on his knees in the dark, in a cave in the Oregon high desert, holding something in his palm that should not exist, and in about 11 minutes, it is going to force you to unlearn everything you were ever taught about the first people to set foot on this continent. Because what he found wasn't a spear point. It wasn't a skull, wasn't even a tool. It was something far stranger, far older, and far more damning to the official story. And by the end of this video, you're going to understand why some of the most respected scientists in North America spent 40 years trying to make this evidence disappear and failed. For almost 100 years, every American schoolchild was taught the same tidy little story, and it went like this. Sometime around 13,000 years ago, a small band of hunters walked across a strip of frozen ground connecting Siberia to Alaska, a place called Berinya, slipped south through a narrow gap that had just cracked open between two retreating walls of glacial ice, and became the first human beings to ever lay eyes on North and South America. We even gave them a name, the Clovis people, after a dusty town in New Mexico where their signature weapon first turned up in a gravel pit in the 1930s, a razor-sharp stone spear point with a long groove carved down the center, engineered to be light, lethal, and strong enough to bring down a woolly mammoth 12 feet at the shoulder. For decades, wherever archaeologists found one of those fluted points in the ground, the assumption was automatic. Clovis was here and Clovis was first, full stop, end of argument. Stop and actually feel how recent that timeline is. 13,000 years ago, the pyramids of Giza were still 8,000 years in the future. No one on the planet had invented writing yet. In the story we were handed in textbooks, the entire human saga of two enormous continents, from the Arctic Circle down to the tip of Patagonia, was supposed to fit inside that one narrow sliver of time. And for most of the 20th century, nobody in. Mainstream academia was allowed to seriously suggest otherwise. Careers were staked on it. Tenure was built on it. Funding depended on defending it. Which is exactly why what happened next reads less like a scientific discovery and more like a public execution of a man's career, until the evidence simply refused to die. It started, almost absurdly, with a groundhog. In 1955, on a quiet hillside, 7 miles up from the Ohio River in western Pennsylvania, a local historian named Albert Miller was walking a property he knew well. A deep sandstone overhang locals had always called a good place to wait out a storm when he noticed a groundhog had been busy, tunneling and had kicked loose soil up around its burrow. Miller knelt down out of pure curiosity, worked his fingers into the loose earth, and pulled out something that made him go very still. He was no professional archaeologist, but he had spent enough of his life around local history to recognize that what he was holding didn't belong anywhere near the surface of a Pennsylvania hillside. And then he did something almost nobody does when they find something extraordinary. He told almost no one, quietly covered the spot back over, and waited. He waited 18 years for the right person to come and do it properly. That person turned out to be a young archaeologist named James Adovazio, who arrived at what would become known as Meadowcroft Rock Shelter in 1973 and began excavating the way a surgeon operates, not a treasure hunter, peeling back the floor of that shelter one impossibly thin layer at a time, logging every flake, every fragment, every grain, because the deeper his team dug, the older the story beneath his trowel kept. Getting. When the radiocarbon results finally came back, they weren't just surprising, they were radioactive in the professional sense of the word. Humans, the data said, had been sheltering under that rock as far back as 16 to 19,000 years ago, several 1,000 years before Clovis hunters were ever supposed to have crossed into the Americas at all. Adovazio knew immediately what kind of storm he was about to walk into. And in 1980, he published the findings anyway in one of the most respected journals in the field and stated plainly that the raining model was wrong. The backlash was immediate, and it was vicious. Rival researchers picked apart every sample. Maybe ancient coal deposits in the soil had contaminated the carbon readings, they argued. Maybe groundwater had thrown the whole chronology off by thousands of years. Some colleagues refused to even engage with the data directly, dismissing the site at conference after conference for years, then decades, while Adovazio kept defending dirt he had excavated with his own two hands against people who had never once set foot in his trench. Researchers eventually coined a name for the stubborn refusal to even consider a pre-Clovis America. They called it Clovis primacy and treated any challenge to it as almost heretical. But here's the twist nobody saw coming. While the entire field was locked in a decades-long shouting match over whether the first Americans arrived 12,000 years ago or 16,000 years ago, almost nobody was paying attention to a quiet, sun-bleached cave system 2,000 miles away in the Oregon desert, where the ground itself was about to make the Pennsylvania argument look like a minor disagreement. Before you follow me into that Oregon cave, understand this. What's coming isn't one discovery, it's 4, stacked on top of each other like evidence in a case that keeps getting worse for the defense. And the last one on this list is so old, it doesn't just break the Clovis story, it points toward the unsettling possibility that whoever was standing on this continent first might not have even been us. If that's the kind of rabbit hole you want to fall all the way down, stay with me, because it only gets stranger from here. The site is called Paisley Caves, a scatter of shallow rock shelters tucked into the dry, wind-swept high desert of south-central Oregon, a landscape so harsh and so dry that almost nothing organic ever fully breaks down. And that single, unglamorous environmental fact is precisely why this place became one of the single most important archaeological sites on the entire continent. Picture the scene the way University of Oregon archaeologist Dennis Jenkins and his team experienced it. The air inside those caves stays cool and still year-round. The walls are coated in a fine, pale dust, and underfoot lies a soft, ash-colored sediment that hadn't been disturbed by human hands in well over 14,000 years. Every single centimeter Jenkins' team excavated. Downward was another step backward through time, and buried just beneath the surface was the discovery that would end a century-old argument. Except it wasn't a weapon, it wasn't a fire pit, and it wasn't a burial. It was dried human waste. I promise you, unglamorous as that sounds, those small fossilized fragments turned out to be more scientifically valuable than almost any spear point ever pulled from American soil, because locked inside those ancient cells, preserved by decades of bone-dried desert air, was intact human DNA. When researchers extracted and sequenced the genetic material, the result landed like a thunderclap. It matched the founding genetic lineages carried by Native American populations today, the haplogroups researchers label A2s and B2. These weren't the remains of some mysterious, unrelated population that vanished without a trace. They were, genetically speaking, direct ancestors of people who are alive on this continent right now. To nail down exactly how old the material was, scientists turned to accelerator mass spectrometry, a dating method precise enough to read the age of the organic material itself rather than the rock and soil surrounding it. The calibrated result came back at over 14,000 years before present. Put that in perspective. That's roughly 4,000 years before the founding of Jericho, and about 6,000 years before anyone anywhere on Earth had invented writing. The so-called first Americans, the Clovis hunters, wouldn't set foot on this continent for another full 1,000 years after these people had already been born, lived their entire lives, and died in what is now Oregon. One cave, one sample. And already the official story had a crack running clean up the middle of it. But a single date, however solid, can always be argued away by a determined critic. The next site didn't just add another crack, it sealed the whole thing in volcanic stone. About 70 miles from Paisley Caves, just outside the tiny town of Riley in Harney County, sits a site called Rimrock Draw Rock Shelter, where an excavation led by University of Oregon archaeologist Dr. Patrick O'Grady began quietly turning the Clovis timeline upside down starting in 2011. This site didn't hand researchers preserved DNA. It handed them something almost as powerful: stone tools, ancient animal remains, and a natural built-in clock written directly into the layers of the earth in the form of volcanic ash. Running through the sediment like a chalk line someone had drawn straight across the centuries was a thin, pale band that O'Grady's team traced back to a specific, well-documented eruption of Mount St. Helens roughly 15,400 to 15,600 years ago. Anything above that ash line was younger. Anything below it was unquestionably older, because a volcano over 1,000 miles away had unknowingly stamped a precise, unforgeable timestamp into that Oregon soil and left it waiting to be found. And below that ash line, the story got genuinely strange. The team recovered roughly 24 fragments of fossilized tooth enamel. Small, easy to overlook, but carrying an enormous amount of information. One tooth belonged to an extinct Ice Age camel species that once roamed western North America. Another belonged to Bison antiquus, a massive, heavy-boned ancestor of the modern buffalo. Both species had been extinct for thousands of years, and here they were, resting together in sediment sealed beneath ash that predates the pyramids by more than 10,000 years. Then O'Grady's team found the tool that changed everything. In that same layer sat a hand-worked scraper, carved from orange chalcedony, a form of agate that catches light almost like polished copper. Turning it over, researchers found multiple distinct working edges: a curved cutting surface, a flat scraper edge, a serrated edge worn smooth from repeated use. The kind of multi-purpose design one archaeologist later compared to an early version of a Swiss Army knife. Sit with that image for a second. A single hand-shaped tool, polished by years of daily use, dropped into the Oregon dirt by a person who had no idea they were about to become the only surviving proof that they had ever existed at all. And here is where the timeline truly cracked open. That tool was found roughly 10 centimeters below the layer containing the camel and bison teeth, which meant, geologically, that it was even older than those animal remains. And when those bones were finally tested, the results came back at somewhere between 21 and 22,000 years old. Sit with that number too. 22,000 years ago was the absolute peak of the last ice age, a period when most of Canada lay buried beneath a sheet of glacial ice nearly 2 miles thick, and the so-called ice-free corridor that Clovis hunters supposedly walked south through wouldn't even exist for another 7,000 years. And yet someone was already standing in what is now Oregon, butchering ice age camels with a hand-carved stone tool. O'Grady himself later admitted how unsettling it was to be holding a single date that old. You don't say a number like that out loud casually, not without something solid underneath it. But this wasn't one shaky date. It was 2 independent tests, run on 2 different kinds of material, landing on the exact same impossible window of time. And here's the detail that should genuinely stop you in your tracks. The tools coming out of rimrock draw don't even resemble Clovis technology. They belong to what archaeologists call the Western stem tradition, long, narrow-bladed points with weak shoulders and rounded bases, built by hands trained in a completely different tool-making philosophy. If Clovis points were engineered for raw, brute-killing power, Western stemmed points came from an entirely different lineage of knowledge, carried here by an entirely different group of people, showing up in the archaeological record thousands of years before a single fluted Clovis point ever touched this soil. That one detail alone collapses the entire logic of Clovis first, because you cannot claim to be the first people on a continent when someone else was already there, generations earlier, leaving behind a completely different toolkit in the dirt. So who were they? We don't know their name. We don't know their language. We're only just beginning to trace where their journey across the world actually began. And by the time Rimrock Draw's findings made it into the scientific literature, the Clovis first model wasn't just wounded, it was on life support. But the next 2 discoveries weren't even aimed at Clovis anymore. They were aimed at something far bigger, the very question of when modern humans first arrived on these continents at all. In 2009, researchers working in White Sands National Park in New Mexico, a landscape of endless white gypsum dunes that looks almost lunar under the midday sun, began noticing strange, faint impressions pressed into the dry bed of what had once been an enormous ice age lake called Lake Otero. As the team carefully brushed away the dust, the shapes resolved into something unmistakable. Footprints, 61 of them in total, left behind by real people walking the muddy shoreline of a lake that no longer exists. You could make out individual toes. You could see the natural arch of a human foot. In some prints, you could even see the faint skid mark where someone shifted their weight mid-stride, thousands of years before either of us was born. Stand in that footprint for a moment, in your mind. It's not a legend. It's not a theory printed in a textbook. It's a physical trace left by a real child, or a real parent, or a real hunter walking barefoot, along a lake edge that vanished from the map millennia ago. When researchers first attempted to date the layer in 2021, they used radiocarbon analysis on seeds from an aquatic plant called spiral ditchgrass found in the same sediment, and the results came back at somewhere between 21 and 23,000 years old. That number alone should have settled the debate instantly, but the pushback was immediate and eerily familiar. Critics argued the seeds might have absorbed older carbon from surrounding groundwater, artificially inflating the age by thousands of years, the exact same objection Adovasio had spent decades fighting off in Pennsylvania. So the research team went back and tested again, this time using ancient conifer pollen recovered from the same layers, material that draws its carbon directly from the living plant rather than from groundwater. The result came back nearly identical, 21 to 23,000 years. Then, in 2025, a third independent study published in a major scientific journal tested organic material pulled from wetland mud and shallow lake sediment in the same layer. Pollen, seeds, and mud. 3 completely separate sources of material, all converging on the exact same window of time, the height of the last ice age, a period when northern North America was supposedly locked beneath impassable walls of glacial ice, and modern humans were supposedly nowhere near this continent at all. 23,000 years is genuinely difficult to hold in your head. Stonehenge wouldn't be built for another 18,000 years. Humanity was only just beginning to paint the walls of the caves at Lascaux in France. And those footprints didn't appear alone. Pressed into that same dried lake bed are the tracks of Columbian mammoths and giant ground sloths, animals and people crossing the same wet sand, leaving their stories side by side in the mud. For over 20,000 years. 23,000 years felt at the time like the outer edge of what anyone could believe. Then a highway construction crew in Southern California hit something in the ground that made 23,000 years look almost recent. It began as an unremarkable freeway expansion project in San Diego County. Heavy machinery struck something solid, and when work crews called in paleontologists to investigate, they uncovered the remains of a single mastodon, an enormous elephant-like creature that vanished from North America at the close of the last ice age. The location became known, quietly at first, as the Cerruti mastodon site, but the bones weren't, simply lying undisturbed in the earth. Something had happened to them. Researchers documented distinctive spiral fractures across several of the larger bones, a specific type of break that only occurs when bone is still fresh, still green, and still full of marrow. Fossilized, mineralized bone doesn't snap that way, it crumbles and shatters unevenly. These bones had been deliberately broken open while the animal was newly dead, cracked apart in a pattern used by early humans across the entire globe to extract marrow, one of the most calorie-dense food sources available in the ancient world. And there was more sitting right beside the bones. 5 unusually heavy stone cobbles that geologists confirmed could not possibly have been carried to that spot by natural water flow, meaning something with intention, something with hands and a plan, had deliberately transported those rocks to that location and used them as hammerstones and anvils to smash the bones open. Something intelligent had processed this animal, harvested what it needed, and walked away, leaving nothing behind but broken bone and a scatter of stone tools waiting more than 100,000 years to be found. Then came the dating, and this is where the story stops being merely surprising and starts becoming genuinely disorienting. Researchers used uranium-thorium dating, one of the most reliable techniques available for material of this age, and every single test returned the same staggering figure, roughly 130,700 years old. Let that number actually sink in. 130,000 years is more than 10 times older than the Clovis timeline. It predates the oldest confirmed cave paintings on the planet, at the point in history when these bones were being deliberately smashed open in what is now California. Our own species, Homo sapiens, had barely even begun migrating out of Africa. The study landed in one of the most respected scientific journals in the world in 2017, and it made a claim so radical that much of mainstream archaeology still refuses to fully engage with it. That some form of human, not modern Homo, sapiens, not Neanderthals, but something else entirely, something we currently have no name for, was present in North America at that almost unthinkably early date. The reaction from the wider scientific community has ranged from cautious skepticism to outright avoidance. Some researchers argue the bone fractures and the cobbles could have resulted from natural geological forces, even though the original geological analysis specifically ruled that explanation out. Others simply decline to cite the paper at all in their own work, as if silence might make the evidence quietly disappear. But the bones haven't moved. The stones haven't moved. And the dates, tested and retested, refuse to budge, which drags the entire investigation back to one enormous, uncomfortable question. If someone, or something, was already present on this continent that long ago, where on earth did they actually come from? Because it clearly wasn't a straightforward walk across a frozen land bridge from Siberia. For most of the last century, the textbook answer to where did the first Americans come from was simple, singular, and, as it turns out, badly incomplete. They walked, the story insisted, across Beringia, the exposed strip of land connecting Siberia to Alaska when Ice Age sea levels dropped low enough to expose it, following one single route into a continent no human being had ever touched before. One people, one path, one moment of arrival. But the mounting evidence is now pushing researchers toward a possibility that used to be dismissed almost instantly. What if some of the earliest people to reach the Americas never walked here at all, but arrived? By boat? And what if that journey didn't begin in Siberia, but far to the south, along the coastline of ancient China? The first real proof that ancient humans were capable of deliberately crossing open ocean came, surprisingly, from the island of Crete in the Mediterranean. Crete has been physically separated from every mainland for roughly 5 million years, meaning every single person who ever set foot on that island had to arrive by sea, not by drifting accidentally on debris, but by deliberately navigating at least 40 miles of open, unforgiving water in some kind of purpose-built vessel. Researchers Thomas Strasser and Eleni Panagopoulou spent years excavating sites along Crete's rocky coastline, pulling stone tools out of soil layers where, according to conventional models, no tools should have existed at all. When those layers were finally dated, the results landed somewhere between 130,000 and 700,000 years old in the toolmaking style. Closely resembled technology associated with Homo heidelbergensis and Homo erectus, ancient human relatives who lived and died long before our own species ever emerged. For a moment, imagine standing in that excavation holding physical proof that our distant hominin cousins were building seaworthy vessels and deliberately navigating open water hundreds of thousands of years earlier than anyone had thought possible. As one member of the research team put it, if early hominins could cross open water more than 130,000 years ago, there was no reason to assume they were incapable of crossing other stretches of ocean as well. And with that single realization, the vast Pacific Ocean stopped looking like an impenetrable wall and started looking like a highway. Genetic evidence added the next piece of the puzzle. Scientists, tracing a specific mitochondrial DNA lineage known as D4H, followed its origin point all the way back to the coastline of ancient China. And instead of discovering a single migration event into the Americas, they found evidence of two entirely separate waves, arriving thousands of years apart, both tracing back to that same ancestral homeland along the Chinese coast. This is where the entire investigation finally comes full circle. The first Americans didn't necessarily come from where generations of textbooks insisted they came from. They didn't all walk, and the route itself was nothing close to what anyone had assumed. The first wave, current evidence suggests, arrived roughly 26,000 years ago, likely traveling by boat, hugging the coastline northward from China, past Japan, and along the edge of the Pacific Rim, requiring no exposed land bridge whatsoever. They had watercraft, and they moved shoreline to shoreline, camp to camp, living off the ocean's resources the entire way. Researchers now have a name for that route, the Kelp Highway, a continuous, resource-rich corridor of coastal marine life stretching along the Pacific edge from Asia all the way down into the Americas. The second wave arrived far later, around 15,000 years ago, taking the traditional overland route across Beringia, the population most closely associated with the later Clovis toolmaking tradition, the very people history once crowned as the original discoverers of the Americas. It turns out they weren't first at all. They were latecomers, walking a path that other people had already been living along for thousands of years by sea, and the clearest piece of physical evidence sits directly in the stone tools themselves. Nearly identical blade styles and flaking techniques show up independently in China, in Japan, and across multiple sites in the Americas. Technology from opposite ends of the Pacific Ocean, so strikingly similar they could almost have been shaped by the same set of hands. That is not coincidence. That is a trail, and it leads directly back across the ocean to the ancient coastline of China. So look at everything one quiet discovery in an Oregon cave managed to set in motion. The Clovis people were not first. The frozen land bridge was never the only door into these continents, and the true timeline of human arrival in the Americas may stretch back not by a few thousand years beyond what the textbooks claimed, but by tens of thousands of years. Every fresh test keeps confirming it, layer after layer, site after site. The preserved human DNA at Paisley Caves, the hand-carved chalcedony tool sealed beneath volcanic ash at Rimrock Draw, the barefoot human footprints pressed into the ancient lake bed at White Sands, the deliberately shattered mastodon bones buried in Southern California, and the coastal genetic trail leading all the way back to ancient China. Each discovery is an independent thread, and every single one of them keeps pulling the old, comfortable story further and further apart. And here's the part that genuinely unsettles me the more I dig into it. Every time researchers push deeper, the evidence keeps getting older, never younger. The original 13,000-year wall collapsed, then 16,000 fell, then 20,000, then 30,000. And now there is a number sitting quietly in the sediment of Southern California, 130,000 years, that mainstream science still doesn't fully know what to do with, because it doesn't just challenge when humans arrived. It challenges who those humans even were. At some point, the real question stops being simply, when did people first arrive on this continent, and starts becoming something far more unsettling. Who were they? Where did they truly come from? And what ultimately happened to them? The clean, simple version most of us were handed in a classroom was never the full truth. These continents were alive with multiple waves of people, arriving from multiple directions, over an almost incomprehensibly long stretch of time. And the textbooks, quite simply, still haven't caught up to the dirt. So here's what I genuinely want to know from you. Out of everything laid out in this video, the ancient human DNA at Paisley Caves, the volcanic ash-sealed tool at Rimrock Draw, the 23,000-year-old footprints at White, 1,000-year-old mastodon bones in California, which single piece of evidence do you personally find hardest to explain away? Which one do you think finally forces the history books to be rewritten? Drop your answer in the comments and tell me exactly why, because I genuinely read through them and I want to see where you land on this. If this pulled you in the way, it pulled me in, hit like, subscribe to the channel, and stay close because there is a lot more still buried in the dirt and we are only just getting started digging it up.